Welcome back to the JSOU Forum. I'm your host, Doug Jordan. And yesterday we asked Dr. Andrew Whiskeyman to lead a panel on existing communication paradigms. Well, today we're going to ask Dr. Juan Garcia to pick up the baton to address the question, how do we overcome these traditional communication practices for new and emerging paradigms? Dr. Garcia, thank you for taking on this challenge, and please introduce your panel.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome back, everyone. As Doug noted yesterday, Dr. Whiskeyman's panel spoke about communication paradigms in a compound security environment. I'm honored to moderate this next panel, which will address the question of how do we overcome traditional communication practices for new and emerging paradigms. With me in order is Dr. Bradley Bloom, Director of Training and Doctrine Development at the United States Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. Dr. Hamilton Bean, a current JSOU non-resident fellow in Strategic Influence and Information Advantage and an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado in Denver, specializing in organizational communication and is also the director of the International Studies program there. And finally, Dr. Scott Ruston, research professor with Arizona State University's Global Security Initiative and director for their Center on Narrative Disinformation and Strategic Influence. As in the other panels, each panelist will present their perspectives and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And as a reminder, please use the hashtag Q when submitting questions. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Bloom. Brad?
Thanks, Juan. Before I get started, I'm going to kind of do a short disclaimer. Please don't leave here and say, here's what they're teaching at SWCS, because I've kind of geared my discussion today from a conceptual perspective. I'm going to share some frameworks that are developmental, some of the things that are actually newly published doctrine, but kind of my focus and discussion is going to be on frameworking and training our SOF warriors, but DoD personnel in general, in some of the competencies that we need to meet. For example, the joint concept for human aspect of military operations that I think are not commonly understood, and a lot of what I believe is missing is a shared lexicon and understanding of what terminology means, and that is a substantive impediment to having a conversation across the table in a similar methodology and being able to articulate behavioral objectives or causality to leadership. And I probably won't get through most of my slides. I'll talk till I'm done, but I kind of put them in order. So first slide, please. Next one. So if you look at the bottom of this screen, you have DoD's view of kind of cross-cultural communication in terms of information and influencing foreign audiences or target audiences. And this is from CJCSI 3126. And you look there and you see core culture, understanding culture, organizational awareness of culture, cultural perspective taking and adaptability. And that's where we get down to kind of training the mind, not only of our leadership, but of our soldiers. And the reason in that box I have language turned yellow is you'll hear a lot of people say, well, if people study a foreign language, they learn culture as well in the study of that language. And that's kind of reverse paradigm. Language is an aspect of culture. It is not in and of itself culture. And I think sometimes that negates our ability to look deeper when we say, well, we have a high requirement for foreign language proficiency. Okay, that means you can talk. It doesn't necessarily mean you're communicating. Regional information and understanding is fairly well covered. When we start talking about building strategic networks and what you see there, if you move to the top, one of my kind of preferred frameworks, because it's easy to explain, is developing a global mindset, which we have as an objective for what we're developing right now in our qualification course. You know, how do you define that? And Cabrera and Unruh kind of say, well, we have psychological capital, and that's the training of the individual. And part of those are trait-based, and part of those can be taught. What is your mindset? Your adaptability to change? Are you able to take the perspectives of a foreign audience? Because if you're going to be predictive of their behavior, you certainly have to put yourself in their shoes without all the inherent biases and cultural mirroring that we all recognize as a potential hazard. and that requires a lot of reflection and self-efficacy. I know reflection has been a topic that we discussed in the green room waiting to come in here. Intellectual capital is what gets us down to cultural knowledge, language, and really analytical frameworks. How do we build frameworks that allow us to look at any culture, not to the exclusion of cultural SMEs, but until they're brought on to the team, how do we differentiate? And there's a lot of academic studies out there, such as the Globe study that builds on Hofstede's elements of culture and breaks them out into things like power distance and time orientation, and having the ability for our soldiers to go look at some of those resources from a agnostic viewpoint in terms of a specific culture, but a framework that we can apply to cultural analysis in general. And then finally, as an outgrowth, and hopefully after you've inculcated some of the first two elements of that social capital, which is an RSOF and US SOCOM kind of forte, building networks, making contacts, and as we make those partner nation contacts, communicating effectively and building a lasting positive connection. And if you break that back to psychological capital, I say quite frequently, I don't care if you're an extrovert, but you need to know how to act like one. And just kind of caveat that by saying culturally sensitive extroversion, vice aggression, which in some other cultures, as you look at it, is immediately off-putting. And those are the types of things that we need to know and understand. Next slide, please. So again, very simple graphic, but I think one of the challenges we have right now in explaining with any level of confidence to leadership how we are going to be able to evaluate relevant actor behavior, anticipate decision-making, and then facilitate that behavior at a time and place that's beneficial to our operations. We have to kind of have a common framework, and I'm not saying this is it, but it's kind of something I've been playing with academically. And if you look at a target audience behavior in a certain condition set, again, that cultural understanding, and I just grabbed Edgar Schein's model of culture, which is artifacts and creations, external manifestations, which includes language, espouse values of that culture, and then fundamental underlying assumptions of how the world works. It's a simple framework to sit down and have a discussion about a specific target audience and situation. If you go to the right, you see conditions. We have any number of frameworks for examining conditions in the operational environment, PMISI PT, system of systems analysis, COG analysis. But at the end of the day, we have to understand those conditions in terms of which ones are encouraging a target audience behavior, whether hostile or positive to our outcome, discouraging to that behavior, or neutral. Because unless we can impact the condition element of why a target audience is behaving in a certain way, it really doesn't matter about the logical, emotional, or values-based element of our appeal in many cases. And then finally, understanding that target audience's motivation, the intensity of the position that they hold that's driving that behavior, the context that led them to that behavior, and then finally the basis for it. Is it logical, rational decision-making? Is it a values-based reflection of their culture? Is it an emotionally based response to a catalyst that we have to understand before we can potentially start to reframe that catalyst and that target audience's understanding of it, particularly if there's a hostile narrative that has made our presence the crux of the issue or misconstrued our intentions. And all of that needs to play a part of our longer term strategy and shaping. So again, just a fairly simplistic triad for explaining behavior. And I have Maslow up there, and obviously Maslow can be overridden. It's just a graphic. But at the end of the day, being able to articulate to our leadership and amongst ourselves a causality or at least correlation for behavior that's tied to here is a cultural basis, here are the conditional impacts, here's the motivation. And that enables us to start asking specific questions of the intelligence community to confirm or deny our basic hypotheses or to do further research. And having something this simplistic that you can then basically take any other theory for behavior and add it on to one or more of those as you grow in understanding and expertise I think is helpful. What do you teach people when they're just starting out? It can't be everything. Here's 15 different theories of behavior and cross-cultural communication. What are they going to retain? What are they going to use? And how do we have a common discussion? Next slide. So go ahead and build that slide out. So I think if we all in this forum, because of our presence and interest, kind of recognize that our narratives and our actions have to match. Our narratives have to be credible, consistent, persuasive, and pervasive over time. And in the media environment, we have to understand, again, a fairly strong correlation, if not cause and effect, for target audience behavior. And then make sure that our actions align with that narrative, that our actions are impacting meaningful conditions that drive behavior, and look for that cause and effect. But I think what we often lose sight of, because we get so enamored of our process and the brilliance with which we've synchronized the military element of information towards a national outcome, are all of those unstructured perceptions that we're competing with every day, to the positive or the negative, but that uncontrolled cultural brand America message. And I think in most cases, if you look at our own news and editorial and even our political discussion, while American citizens understand the nature, the points, and the impact somebody is trying to have on the electoral process with their narrative back and forth, from a foreign perspective, listening to it, what has become a very polarized and at times personal attack-centric relationship, it does not paint a pretty picture of who we are in terms of values, aspirations, and so forth. So it goes back to Sun Tzu: know yourself, not just this structured thing that we're trying to do off to the left that has synchronized information and physical elements of power in achieving the operational or strategic mission, but also that background noise that we can't control, because we have to account for that and compensate for it in our approaches. Next. Okay, so this is actually present in our newest publication, TM 3-53 TAC 11, Influence. And what this represents is what we call the hierarchy of psychological effects model. It's what we are beginning to integrate into our curriculum for, again, our students to use as a conceptual framework. And if you look at the top, you have a negative behavior on the far left of the spectrum, positive behavior on the far right of the spectrum. And in the center at neutral is informational awareness. And that goes down to relevant actors, narratives, and our target audience. So as we identify a behavioral objective, whether it's to de-escalate violent extremist organization attacks on the far left, or a positive behavior by a target audience that reinforces our objectives, support the provisional government, upcoming elections, what have you. It's important that we identify who is in that space, why they're in that space. Again, going to the bottom left and looking at a model of explanation. Is this culture, conditions? What is the motivation? And then start breaking them down by demographics. Historically, we've tended to go with military age males between 17 and 21 years old, because that's everybody who might be exploited in a security environment, rather than saying, hey, we kind of have to group people by where they are and understand why we're there, why they are there, and then determine if we can reach that audience, if they're susceptible, if they even have access to our narrative. One of the things I talk about is footprint, time print, and cultural relevance of a message. If we were to take a North Korean audience right now, as far as the time print of the narrative that permeates the culture they've been raised in, the actual physical location of those dissemination assets and their access to anything else, both of those are fairly low. So when you look at the probability of moving them externally, it's a challenge. And one of the other things with this particular model is you really need to have access. Social media and AI in an open society would allow us to understand movement from positive attitude to positive preference by media tracking and AI and predictive analytics. But an environment where we don't have access to that or the population directly, then you start getting a tertiary methodology for collection, either through diaspora or folks abroad or other forms of intelligence. And when you do that, your confidence level starts to drop because it's not really the solid data that you would look at. Next. So I think this is, again, kind of conceptual, but I think part of our challenge, if you look at this, is taking a baseline kind of African scenario where you have environmental decay that leads to displacement of a population into a megacity area that's unprepared to receive them. That creates an opportunity for violent actors to come in as a catalyst and create a mobilized terrorism for a mobilized violent extremist for a variety of potential reasons. DOD usually gets called in when we've hit the symptomatic phase, when we have a VEO movement or the threat of it. But if you go back and look at that causality link, whole of government approach across the competition continuum, proactive versus reactive. When you start talking about root causes, these things are extremely complex, take a long time to solve. The number of variables is almost unfathomable. And I think we, again, need to go to a methodology where we can say, okay, how do we become predictive? Where can we see root causes? How can we then predict movement and get stuff in place ahead of time so that we can potentially remove some of those catalysts before it moves to the mobilized violent extremist? And again, now we're into that whole of government approach with our partners, with State Department, with USAID. But again, part of the reason I've popped this up is to go back and discuss, frameworking. How do we all have a common conversation about the problem? Again, just some frameworking discussions. We have more, but at the end of the day, to stomp my foot, I think we need a common language and a common framework so we can get everybody moving in the same direction and again, meeting that goal of evaluating relevant actor behavior, attributing its causality, anticipating decision-making through cultural savvy and competence, and then finally influencing that well in decision-making, which is our final outcome. Over.
Thank you very much, Brad. Really appreciate the comments. Now we're gonna shift over to Dr. Hamilton B. Hamilton.
Thanks a lot, Juan. So I'm going to be keeping with the theme of self-reflection, which is a strong theme I think we've heard throughout today's remarks, giving you a kind of civilian academic perspective on the orienting question. So the orienting question for this session is, how do we overcome traditional communication practices for new and emerging paradigms? Oh, there they are. And I think it's helpful if we break down this question a little bit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first part of this question, how do we overcome traditional communication practices? I think it's important to ask, well, what do we mean by traditional communication practices? Is that the use of mass media channels, one-way dissemination techniques, behavior change, source concealment? These are all practices that we've talked about in this forum across the 2 days. But we have to recognize that these practices and others, they stem from our conception of what communication is, our model of communication. And so we need to be more aware of what that model or that overarching theory of communication maintains. Next slide, please. Likewise, we look at the back half of this orienting question. How do we overcome traditional communication practices for new and emerging paradigms? We have to ask, well, what's a new and emerging paradigm? And in the read ahead materials that we were provided, we learned about some of them: strategic influence, information advantage, coercive disclosure, persistent engagement, and we've heard about others over the last 2 days in this forum. But again, our paradigms also relate to our underlying model of communication, our underlying theory of communication. So next slide, please. So what is a model or a theory of communication? Well, in his really foundational article in 1999, communication theorist Robert Craig, he wrote that communication is a really unique discipline. Unlike, say, geology, which has a theory of the earth and a dominant theory and a way of explaining the creation of the earth, in communication, we actually have seven theories or 7 traditions of communication theorizing, each one valuable for explaining a facet or an aspect of communication in ways that the other theories don't really address that well. And so this is a little unusual, right, in social scientific research. Now, of course, we don't have time to go through these different models or traditions of communication theory, but I think it's important that we recognize that there are these different conceptions of what communication is. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the read-ahead materials we provided, we start to see some patterns in how communication is described, how it's understood. In the Atlantic article, we can see communication is about disclosure. It's about inoculating audiences. It's based in psychological research. Next slide, please. The War on the Rocks article talked about communication is to deter, delegitimize, and bring pressure on adversaries. It's about gaining and shaping public opinion. That article also explains that it's about changes in behavior and parties paying a price for their communication behavior. Next slide, please. In the RAND report, we read that for deterrence to succeed, the deterring party must be capable, credible, and able to communicate effectively. Great. Well, what does communicate effectively mean? We learn later in the report it's about shaping and dominating in the short and long terms. Next slide, please. In the Fourth Age of SOF report, we don't get a particularly focused view of what communication is, but it is around information dissemination. It's about political effects and so on. Next slide, please. So what we start to see across these readings and across a lot of the commentary that we've listened to over the last couple of days, we're starting to see what we call the socio-psychological model of communication. And this is about interpersonal interaction. It's a behavioral approach. It's focused on stimuli and reaction, about cause and effect. It's about expression, interaction, and influence, which is completely appropriate for the kinds of topics that we've been exploring in the forum. It originates in psychology and sociology, and it tends to be quite objective. But the point is, this socio-psychological model of communication is just one of many. Next slide, please. If we look at some just random book covers of other approaches to communication, the one on the left, Strategic Conspiracy Narratives, a Semiotic Approach. This is drawing from the semiotic tradition of communication theorizing or the study of signs. The one in the middle is the Handbook of Critical Intercultural Communication, which provides a critical tradition, a critical approach. The one on the right is Metaphor and Persuasion in Strategic Communication. This is drawing from a rhetorical approach or rhetorical tradition. So again, these different traditions or theories of communication may offer us some resources that we might otherwise overlook if we're just approaching communication from that dominant socio-psychological perspective. Next slide, please. So my point is not to develop every SOF professional into a communication theorist, although I personally think that that would be pretty cool. It's instead to cultivate more self-awareness of our own taken for granted assumptions about what communication is, our underlying model of communication. And of course, for much of the kind of work that we're talking about in this forum over the last 2 days, that socio-psychological model is completely appropriate. And it's important to understand how it works. But developing our understanding of other traditions of communication theory, of basically our meta-theoretical awareness, this can allow us a better insight onto about the strengths and limitations of that socio-psychological model. It also lets us make more strategic and intentional choices about how we practice communication, and more informed selection of communication practices can then transform relationships in different ways. And I think this gets at what General Nagata was talking about this morning. Next slide, please. For example, what are the communication practices through which SOF professionals might switch from a shaping and dominating approach to communication to jointly achieving desired goals such as trust building and collaboration? How do our assumptions about what communication is enable and constrain interaction between SOF professionals and the people that they're speaking to? Next slide, please. So I would argue we need a slightly reframed orienting question to be helpful to us. How can we better recognize the influence of models of communication to help SOF stakeholders, SOF professionals creatively practice it, and it being communication? So how do SOF stakeholders learn to practice communication through academic programs, through formal training, through informal socialization? Which norms, beliefs, and values about communication do these programs promote, and which do they marginalize or omit? How might SOF professionals incorporate communication theory and meta theory into ongoing frameworks and developments? Last slide, please. So I'm trying to do this in my own project as a JSOU non-resident fellow. I'm looking, the nominal title of my project is Why the Model Matters, Communication Within Joint Publication 3-04, Information Joint Operations. And I'm looking at what is the underlying model of communication that sort of undergirds the document, and how might we be able to intentionally and strategically shift our theory or model of communication to illuminate aspects of deterrence and influence in novel and unique ways. Thank you very much. Juan, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. B. And now, Scott, the floor is yours.
Good morning, all, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the forum. As you might imagine from the name of my center, thinking about strategic influence in today's complex information environment is on my mind a lot. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to share an idea. What I'm going to do today in the time allotted, because I really think the most value of this session will actually be in the rich discussion to follow. So thinking a little bit about strategic influence, it used to be you could park a carrier strike group off the coast of a country and you had instant, clear, definable strategic influence. And then when the strike group went away, that effect ended. And now I contrast that with the efforts of the Russians to have some form of strategic influence on the public discourse and political polarization in the United States in 2016. Does anybody know the final answer to that? No, I think we're still working that out. Does anybody deny that there were some effects? No, I don't think anybody denies that. Does anybody know precisely the degree to which those effects are continuing? No, certainly not with any precision. But does anybody deny that the episode reveals the potential for strategic influence through the manipulation of the information environment? And there again, I would say, no, I don't think anybody's denying that. But what it reveals is that we've got a long way to go thinking through that. So I want to share briefly an idea that hopefully stimulates some thought and discussion germane to the panel theme about dealing with the complexity of the contemporary environment and altering communication practices. And the practices that I'm going to suggest a sort of a theoretical idea is actually the organizational practices, less so than the message-centric sorts of practices. But that first requires me to talk a little bit about complexity. So if we can bring up the slides, we've got a variety of aspects of complexity going on. We've got audience complexity. We can't count on a clear distinction between local, regional, and global audiences. Take, for example, the Last Night in Sweden influence campaign, which started as largely regional and national influence campaign. It spreads globally, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly. We've got media ecosystem complexity. In an old school model, the international relations, world events all had a degree of common understanding that enabled a disciplined and fairly narrowly framed approach to strategic narrative. Governments and diplomats talked to each other, pundits observed behaviors, and reporters talked to the bureaucrats, the pundits, the technocrats, and the diplomats. And any man on the street reporting was to give a little local flavor and color. But today, we've got citizens as news reporters, though they often operate without training, without professional standards of practice, and sometimes without ethics. Citizens are also the voters. Citizens are clustering as groups of information consumers in new ways, and all members of the ecosystem have access to those groups in ways that used to be a very capitally intensive process. That also, we see a change in the audience-producer relationship. Not only are more people having more access to more information than ever before, that's the democratization of information, sort of zealously attributed to the Web 2.0. But I would argue also that more people are producers and distributors of information, which has had radical effects on things like editorial oversight. And this also makes the idea of a target audience a bit less distinct, because audiences are connected in ways that may or may not be immediately discernible, and effects on target audience may have longer reaching and non-forecastable effects. So if we go to the next slide, please. I don't think I need to convince this audience of the threat represented by influence campaigns, but I will make one brief point about how it, I think, is particularly relevant to the SOF community. So with the idea that liberal democracies derive their power and their sovereignty from the political will of their people, and the people express that political will through voting, and they do so with access to information, with access to beliefs, with access to values and norms, that expression of political will becomes a center of gravity. And with the proliferation of access points that I just described, that comes vulnerabilities. And so the power to directly impact the expression of political will, not through the coercive power of kinetic force or that carrier strike group off the coast, but through the manipulation of decision-making beliefs and social norms, that's some tactical action with strategic level effects. So I think quite germane to this community. So here's the idea I want to offer. And this was published by two colleagues of mine at ASU a number of years ago. And I think it's quite germane to this conversation about developing new practices for the contemporary information environment. And again, this is more about thinking in a different way about our organizational practices and our organizational structures than necessarily crafting the perfect message, which I would substantially argue against the practice of crafting the perfect message for a whole variety of reasons. So if we go on to next slide, please. So we call this the rugged landscape. We can go ahead to the next one. And simply put, this idea compares a situation. Now, the landscape that you see is not a physical landscape, it's a conceptual landscape, wherein the height of the z-axis is the effectiveness of a solution to whatever problem you're dealing with. The x and y axes are the range of possible solutions. So in an environment of low variability and low interdependency of components, a single highly optimal solution is possible. This is analogous to the idea of trying to control the narrative, which I think is, for the reasons that I just described about the complexity of the environment, we are not in a complex, simple landscape. We are in a complicated landscape. And so that controlling the narrative idea is a little bit challenged. With the interdependencies and complexities of the contemporary environment, the resulting landscape of possible solutions and possible effects is much more rugged, much more varied. It's much more like the lower image, where you've got lots of different peaks. Some are higher, some are lower. There are some valleys in between. And the problem is you don't know what the answer is when you start trying to find that ideal solution. So what do you do in a rugged landscape? And Corman and Cooley, the authors of this theory, propose, if we can go to the next slide, 4 recommendations. And they boil down to this. I'll leave the excerpts from the paper on screen, but really what they boil down to is frequent and rapid experimentation. A central part also is decentralized control. And I think in this context, that means thinking about release authority, thinking about the structuring of campaigns, and then the willingness to accept risk. And there too, there's important discussions to be had about who owns the risk and at what level is the appropriate owning of that risk, and what's the appropriate level of risk averseness versus risk tolerance. So in the interests of moving to the question and answer period, I'll just throw one observational. So the paper, Cooley and Corman in the paper use the Bush 43 presidential campaign as a model, an organizational practice optimized towards the simple landscape. Very much a control the message, high levels of message discipline, high levels of single control authority to the message, and it was reasonably effective. But also think about this. This is in the late 1990s, early for the 2000 election, that approach was optimized for. I would suggest that you contrast that to the Trump 2016 campaign, as well as the Trump 2020 campaign, where substantial levels of experimentation are going on. Not even, maybe not so much disciplined experimentation, but the idea, and this is an example of, if you can see the dots on the screen, and I'm not sure if it comes through clear enough, that In the rugged landscape, the wide range of experimentation with a bunch of different possible solutions has a much higher likelihood of landing on any peak, including the highest peak, than a very disciplined, controlled, narrowly framed approach to finding that optimal solution. So I'll pause there and thank you for the opportunity and the attention. And let's move to questions and see where the dialogue goes.
Thank you very much, Scott. We do have a couple questions here, so I'll start off. Question asked is basically, so Dr. Bean, you indicated and identified 7 different theories. Dr. Bloom expressed how military education qualification concerns, or there are concerns for the optimal number of theories. Can you guys speak together on top candidate theories that maybe SOF should be considering?
Sure. That's a great question. I don't know if there's an ideal number. I think what I was trying to indicate in addressing this question of how we overcome traditional communication practices and for new and emerging paradigms is, how do we cultivate awareness of what communication is and how we practice it? I think perhaps just exposing SOF professionals to a handful of other theoretical approaches or paradigms or models of communication beyond the socio-psychological model might be helpful. For example, in my own research, it focuses a lot on the rhetorical tradition. And if you start seeing, for example, Chinese armed forces messaging, even in English, you start to see some really interesting rhetorical patterns, different overlapping tropes that make what we call the rhetoric of Chinese traumatized nationalism effective for certain audiences, but not for others. I'm not sure that the socio-psychological model is the best model for understanding how these tropes work in concert or how they can be thwarted or degraded in some way. And so understanding that rhetorical tradition might be useful in certain contexts. Of course, the vast majority of the work that the SOF community does and that SOF professionals do is oriented around that socio-psychological model, and I think it's completely appropriate. But again, exposing folks to more and different models of what communication is would be helpful. I don't know if there's an ideal number, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4, something like that.
Thank you. Brad, any comments on that one?
Yeah, the interesting thing with theories, aside from the ones we're most familiar with being decidedly from a Western perspective, is they have to be filtered through that cross-cultural competency. And I think as we look at, student overload and learning overload and, senior willingness to engage in a theoretical discussion versus something that we can provide an objective comment for and adds a level of confidence to our attempts to not only predict behavior, but drive it from an academic perspective is really the dominant requirement. We're filtering through any number right now. And one of the things that I have my team working on is, okay, how do I translate this into a worksheet or a template that lets me brief in a simple, clear, and concise manner with a fairly high level of confidence, validated by the JSOU, for example, which I think is another requirement that we sometimes don't pay attention to. We ask our influence practitioners to be their own analysts. And if you look at what the intelligence community is required to do in terms of confidence levels, citation and source, alternative competing hypotheses to dismiss causality for something other than something that we created, I think we have to have that same level of confidence in our behavioral approaches, and I don't think we're there yet. So what can I quantify? What adds confidence to my projection? And what can I teach in a relatively quick period of time that is executable by the practitioner without having a doctoral level of knowledge to do so?
Thank you. I'm sorry.
I was going to say sort of 2 quick points. I think Hamilton's appeal for accessing the multiple dimensions of value that a variety of communication theories and traditions offer is complementary to this idea of the rugged landscape. You're not going to always use the same theory and approach and model to optimize your solution with in every attempt. The challenge that we have, and this is, I think, a little bit in Brad's comments, is that for some appropriate reasons, the way we train, the way we educate, whether it's in the military or out, is optimized for an industrial model. And that's particularly true in the military because we have to have a pipeline that's continually moving through, which means that we always, for allocation of resources, we kind of want to train the same all the time, and so that we have the same product coming out the other end. But I would argue that the communication environment, for the reasons that Hamilton introduced his talk with, and for the changes of the 21st century that I alluded to, doesn't really the affordances of the industrialized approach to the affordances of the communication environment are wildly out of sync. And so I wish I had a magic bullet solution, and I don't, but I think there's a lot of thinking to be done to adapt that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a couple of the questions to sort of put them together, because when you spoke of rugged landscape, that actually leads into one of the questions asked, which is, does the rugged landscape foster misinformation? And the point they were trying to make was that, your example of the 2020 presidential election, and does that model factor that in? And do you have any examples of best and worst practices that we've done on that?
So I'll take the first part of the question about, does it foster misinformation? I would say that there's a high degree that it could foster misinformation. The degree to which it has the potential to foster dis or malinformation would be how it is used. But the misinformation part, so the distinction I make there, disinformation, false, misleading, inaccurate information distributed willfully with an intent to do harm or deceive. Malinformation, a type of information that is intentionally designed to do some kind of immediate harm, social or psychological. Misinformation, a bit more innocuous. It's unlinked from that intent component, and how the audience is going to, any particular audience. And I'm a believer that you can't control your audience anymore. You've got your target audience, but the entire, there's a lot of audiences that you're not going to be able to control. And I think I like to use the Trump campaign a lot when trying to illustrate various communications idea, because regardless of any thoughts about policy and other things that you would want, the president or a presidential candidate to be doing, but simply as an operator in the information environment, I think he he and his campaign, and who actually is responsible for this, is the innate savvy of the individual that is Donald Trump versus the team around him. That I don't know, but they operated very effectively with high degree of experimentation, exceptionally high risk tolerance, and I would argue proved that for those campaigns, their acceptance of risk was not was not a deterrent. Now, granted, there's a lot of arguments out there that their freewheeling approach and their willingness to experiment meant that they were spreading a lot of information that they may have knowingly known was not true. That's a little bit of a separate issue, but I think that's controllable within an organization like a SOF unit that is charged with the degree of communication, whether at the tactical or operational level.
Okay. Any other comments from the panelists on that one?
Yeah, I had one. A lot of the discussion around misinformation, disinformation is inoculation. We talked earlier about democracies deriving their ability to operate from the will of the people. And when you discuss inoculation, you're really talking about two things, which is trust and critical thinking. Trust in the message that is coming from your political leadership, and critical thinking on the part of the reader. All of the polls right now are showing a substantive decline in trust in not only politicians, but also our news media and even the military itself in the most recent polls. And critical thinking, I think if you look at most of the academic literature, is also not a core focus of our elementary and grade school instructional curricula these days. And I think that bodes a fairly substantial challenge moving forward in an environment where we cannot employ the media censorship that some of our strategic competitors are able to use against their own populace.
Thank you. Actually, that sort of leads me to the next question that we've got, is given the complexity of the information environment and some of these new paradigms, where do you see, and they use communication modeling, but I also include theory, going in the future, especially with the high level of misinformation and disinformation that is, affecting the information environment?
I'll take a crack to kick off, and then so with all of the, one might take my comments as like all doom and gloom and we're sunk. But the digitization of the information environment brings some affordances of capability to. Disinformation is detectable. It's not easy. There's lots of different groups working on improved capabilities. Some of that gets back to that definition piece, but detecting different types of information, absolutely possible. It's possible at scale. Discerning networks of influence is available and is increasingly automatable for speed and scale. And then the intent element is becoming increasingly characterizable, including with computational assistance that can get after that. The X factor that's still really, really hard is the meaning part. And this is where I go back to plug for Hamilton, the semiotic and the rhetorical communication models, which I think personally we need to foreground and elevate those to marry those with the social psychological, which slides over into computationally assisted approaches more easily than the semiotic and the rhetorical. But we're getting there. And so the sort of short version is we'll have tools, lots of different groups, including funded by large DoD research agencies working on technologies to help in this realm. The key element is marrying up how is this actually making meaning to a significant audience with some of the cultural elements that Brad was talking about earlier.
Any other comments, Dr. Bean, Dr. Bloom?
I would just say that our definition of misinformation changes based on the model of communication that we're using.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Really appreciate your time and your insights. I think this has been incredibly informative. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions, great questions. And so with that, Doug, this concludes the panel. Over to you.
So thanks to Dr. Juan Garcia, JSOU faculty, Dr. Hamilton Bean, one of our first class of non-resident JSOU fellows, Dr. Brad Bloom, who's working on curriculum down at John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, and our colleague for many years, Dr. Scott Ruston out of Arizona State University. Several compelling arguments in this segment that are worthy of research. If you are interested, you're in our audience and you're interested in conducting some research or partnering on research, you can contact us here at JSOU and we can put you in contact with other academics. We are always looking for help, and if you're looking to research something, we're looking to help you.